MacLeod, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 21. Written by Cathy McRae. Narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk.
MacLeod, Chapter 1. The sight of the sea took my breath away. I closed my eyes and drank in the tang of salt in the air, the muffled crash of the waves against the shore, bringing memories of my youth flooding back. Cool fingers of air caressed my cheeks and ruffled my shoulder-length hair. My eyes opened, sighting the familiar Culloden Mountains across the Sound and the Isle of Rasaay, their peaks dark against the late afternoon sun. 'Twas a sight I'd seen every day of my 16 years as a child on the island, and not one a mere 300 years of ghostly existence could erase from my memory. I was on the Isle of Rasaay. I was home. Movement in the water caught my attention, and I smiled at the play of a small whale as it breached, the sparkling water rolling like diamonds off its dark, wet hide. Gulls screeched overhead, drifting drunkenly on the wind. The scene was heartwarmingly familiar, and yet startlingly different. A pier led to the water, where a large boat docked. Its brilliant white sides and glass-stained upper deck were unlike anything I'd seen before. A number of people disembarked and headed my direction. They chatted amongst themselves, happy sounds as they strolled nearer. Their clothing and conversations alerted me to the fact I was in recent times. The bright, slick material of their coats and my inability to discern male from female at a distance brought to mind the tourists I'd seen lately at the Culloden Visitors Centre. Clad in breeches and bundled shapeless against the cold, it took me a moment to discover the group was made up of 2 women and 3 men. And when I was fair sure 'twas a lad from the way he plodded a wee bit behind the rest of the group. He shifted a rucksack across his drooped shoulders, the slippery whisper of material reaching my ears in the clear air. One woman in the group slowed her step and, angling her body toward the lad, motioned with a flick of her wrist for him to catch up. One of the men canted his head to the man next to him.
Will you try for Duncan this time? I'd like to get some shots of the skyline from the summit. I need 'em for an article in the E-Mag. Hiking in the Highlands in winter or some such.
His words didn't fall on my ears the same as the speech from my day and time, but I had adjusted to the changing sounds over the years. The other man shrugged.
Not a bad hike to the top, but the weather won't stand for it this time of year, I'm afraid.
The first man looked around and I held my breath, but he didn't notice me.
It's cold, but not too bad, and it looks like the snow will hold off a bit longer. Why don't we see how it looks in the morning? Yeah, maybe. I'm not dressed for sleet if the storm moves in.
His comment made me question my own clothing. A quick glance downward told me I still wore the coat and breeches I'd stolen as I headed off to war more than 270 years ago. I didn't miss my kirtle, but the breeches were filthy from sitting too long on my backside, and the coat was threadbare and faded. Oddly enough, though, the wintry air made my cheeks tingle. I wasn't cold. I brushed as much of the dirt and dust from my breeches as I could and straightened my coat across my shoulders, trying not to drag my fingers through my ill-kempt locks. Squaring my shoulders, I waited for the group to reach me with their curious looks and silly questions, asked of the tour guides I'd seen at the Culloden Visitors Centre, who dressed in the attire of my day. Without sparing me a glance, the group strolled right past, laughing at murmured words I couldn't hear. Had I been vain? I'd have worried they made jest of my raggedness. I was a bit disgruntled by their lack of friendliness, however. Stepping forward, I planted my feet fully on the path, hands fisted on my hips as I glared at their backs. The lad hesitated, casting a glance over his shoulder. He ignored the woman's repeated urging for him to keep up, staring at me with puzzlement in his narrowed eyes. The woman gave him a sharp look, then glanced at me and passed.
Stop dallying, Alex.
What on earth are you staring at? With a hand to the lad's shoulder, she captured his attention, and they rejoined their companions. Ugh, that was a fine welcome. For a moment I considered striking off on my own, but I remembered that no matter what I did or didn't do, my time here was limited, and my fate beyond that uncertain. I shrugged and followed the tourists up the path to Rasaay House, the home the MacLeod chief had built to replace the old Tower Castle 10 years before I was born. I remembered the pretty 3-storey building, with its vegetable garden planted over the old castle site. I'd played there with my brothers and sisters, whilst my ma cooked meals for the chief and his family. We'd been no poorer, no richer than the others on the island, but we likely ate better than most. I glanced up, eagerly looking to the house where it nestled on a pleasant low spot, framed by the trees and hills. Rasaay House faced me, but 'twas a far cry from the building I remembered. A large entry crouched beneath pinnacled gables, and wings flowed to either side. The house I once knew was now an impressive manor, and I felt a swell of pride at the chief's obvious affluence. But a chill of doubt crept over me as I realised the building which once faced north now faced south. The nip of smoke from one of the many chimneys fuelled my memory of the year after Culloden, when many homes on the isle had been burned, often with their inhabitants inside. Had Rasaay House suffered the same fate? The 6 newcomers had almost reached the entrance to the house. I hurried up the trail, my boots, bound with strips of cloth to reinforce the worn soles, making no noise on the rocky path. Sunlight glinted on the large windows with rounded tops. It wasn't like Malcolm MacLeod to put all these windows in. 'Tisn't possible to defend the place with such luxuries, pretty though they were. And I remembered well the stories of the bitter feud between the MacLeods of Rasaay and the MacLeods of Dunvegan, across the water on the Isle of Skye. With the aftermath of Culloden in mind, the chief wouldn't have neglected protecting his own. Why, a bairn could toss a rock or two and scoot inside the broken window as quick as an otter nipping under water. A small door on the side of the rocked portal opened. A young woman waved the group closer. "Welcome to Rasaay House. We've been expecting you. Mind you dinna let the cold inside." They quickened their pace, jostling their bags from one hand to the other. One of the men took a stance in the doorway, holding it ajar for the others. I hurried, only a few paces behind the last as they filed inside. With respect for the solid portal, I jumped over the threshold as the man released it to swing shut in my face. I flinched against the anticipated crack of the wood against my elbow as I raised it to counter the closing door, wanting a moment alone with the lad for a chat about his rudeness. But the sting of injury never struck, and I watched, mouth agape, as the door passed seamlessly over me and closed behind. It had happened enough times in the past 270 years at the Culloden Visitor Centre that I shouldn't have been startled. But I anticipated a return to my earthly body in my quest to do my heroic deed. 'Twas not to be. I was clearly still a ghost. Chapter 2. I tossed my head indignant. "'Tis a fine kettle of fish you've dropped me into, Soni." I scowled into the empty air. The wee witch hadn't implied my task would be easy, but I hadn't thought my presence would be met with such indifference either. A familiar voice answered. "You perhaps expected open arms and a clear path to your heroic deed." The lights around me dimmed, and the living, breathing souls in the house appeared frozen in time. Soni drifted effortlessly through the glass-paned window, robed in black, a green mist trailing her heels like a loyal pit. Her long hair floated behind her, sparkling with tiny snowflakes, the hood of her cape cast back over her shoulders. I rubbed my hand through my own grimy, short-cropped mane. It was a gesture that recognised the sacrifice of my long curly locks the night I'd determined to follow my brothers. The same night I'd shed my gown and identity as Sir Hugh MacLeod, who was banned from the adventure, as it had been described to me, and donned a borrowed jacket and breeches to become Hugh MacLeod, Jacobite patriot. I frowned at the young witch. She was considered the mascot of the Congress of 79 Ghosts who haunted the Culloden battlefield. The others doted on her, and she was welcome to bask in their devotion. She didn't need mine. Up to your usual parlour tricks, I see. You promised a hale body, and to be seen by the mortal folk. Your ability to be seen or not will nae affect your task. Those who need you will know you're here. You'll receive the same boon as the others if you complete your task. Soni's voice sounded serene, not seeming to take offence at my brusqueness. I waved my hand in the air, not ready to let her close enough to see my secrets. Aye, a heroic deed for the ear of the prince. I didn't say I wasn't interested in your plan. I marched with the Glengarry Regiment that day, and I have a few choice words I wish to whisper into the prince's lug. Soni raised a brow. 'Twas interesting for a MacLeod to follow Prince Charlie. 'Twas not about being Protestant or Catholic, I retorted. 'Twas time to have a Stuart back on Scotland's throne, nae a German king. The MacLeods of Skye supported the crown. She nodded, her voice curious. Anger simmered, prickling my skin. I suppose you'll tell me their loyalty was what protected the MacLeods of Rasaay? I know better, witch. I know what happened here. The Culloden Visitor Centre has taught you much. Few of you dared enter its doors, though I doubt there are any among you who needed the reminders. Soni shuddered, remembering as I did her first visit inside the museum. Ewan MacFie had followed her inside, and the vivid depictions had cut them both to the heart. Soni tucked a strand of hair behind an ear. Did you know the prince was quite shocked by the atrocities that followed Culloden? I shrugged. I've heard and read as much. I'd pored over the manuscripts printed on slender pieces of coloured paper, stacked on tabletops, as well as the detailed accounts for anyone to see at the museum. Notwithstanding Ewan's horrific experience in the visitor centre, I found much there to enlighten me. Soni clasped her hands before her and took on a scholarly air. The prince is said to have defended the Duke of Cumberland, saying, surely that man who calls himself a duke and pretends to be so great a general cannot be guilty of such cruelties. I cannot believe it. I can't believe he defended the bastard. I refused to call the Duke by his title, knowing him too well as the Butcher for his acts of cruelty towards the Jacobites. The man ordered all prisoners and wounded shot where they lay on the battlefield. Then he marched to Inverness, littering the trail with the bodies of Jacobite supporters, or any he and his soldiers suspected of being such. He showed no quarter, man, woman, or bairn. Soni tilted her head. Perhaps you would prefer a few words with the Duke of Cumberland instead of Prince Charlie. Her eyes teased, but I didn't smile. I'd prefer fisticuffs, but I'd have to descend into the deepest parts of hell to find him. Soni nodded. You're passionate about what happened to your kin. I am sorry your brothers are listed as those fallen on the battlefield. No family should lose 3 children in one day. My heart constricted as though clenched in a brutal fist. They'd told me I was too young to take up arms. They'd teased me about the hardships, but I didn't listen. They were right. I was colder and hungrier than I'd ever been in my life the day I stared across Culloden Moor, a pistol in my hand. I would have given anything to have been back home doing my chores. Do you wish to continue? You have only a day, mayhap 2 at most, to accomplish your heroic deed. Soni's sympathetic expression pricked my pride. I shot her a narrow look. I'm still leery of your plan, though if Wee Rabbie trusted you enough to accept your offer, I can do the same. Alexander Fraser was allowed to prove to the lad my intentions are sincere. Are you in need of reassurance as well? I thought you and I parted on amicable terms on the moor. My mouth was suddenly dry. What happens when this is over? You must answer that for yourself, Soni replied. You haven't been gone from Dromossie Moor very long. Give yourself a few moments to adjust. For even were you to choose not to complete your task, you cannae return. I shuffled my feet on the smooth floor. I didn't know what lies before me, but I've had my fill of years haunting the moor, and I'm ready to have a few words with our bonny prince. I gave her a confident look. I will see this through. Though how I can accomplish much when no one can see me, I dinna know. Soni's image faded, the green mist spiralling toward the ceiling. Young eyes can often see what older ones cannae. Look to the wee one, lass. Her voice faded away, and she was gone before I realised she'd called me lass. Chapter 3. The room brightened, and the normal sounds of the house returned. No one appeared discomfited to have been set aside whilst Soni and I had our wee chat. But it took me a moment to shake off the unworldly feeling. What had Soni said? Those who needed me would know I was there. I glanced at the group of people in front of me. Not one of them seemed to be aware of my existence. I shifted my gaze to the lad. The lad could see me. He peered at me again over his shoulder, a frown on his face. Pay attention, Alex. Cease your fidgeting and stop staring into space. The woman gave his coat sleeve a straightening tug and turned her attention back to the woman from Rasaay House. After a last glance in my direction, the lad followed her lead. The young woman continued her lecture. The original building was a 3-storey tower castle called Kilmalloig Castle, or Tor Iarn Gareth, which stood on this very spot. In 1720, the tower was pulled down and the first Rasaay house built next to it. The first Rasaay house? This didn't bode well. I slipped closer, wanting to catch every word. The lad took one step to the side as though he thought to block me, but I edged to my left, dodging him neatly. His eyes narrowed. I wiggled my fingers at him. He scowled, but I ignored him. During the aftermath of the Battle of Culloden, Rasaay House was burnt in revenge by Captain John Ferguson as he conducted his search for Bonnie Prince Charlie, who slipped through government forces as it became clear the Battle of Culloden was lost. Och, he didn't slip through the government forces. He had watched the entire battle, short as it was, from a safe position behind his army. By the time I tried to leave the field, he was long gone. But he had spent the next 5 months or so dodging the English soldiers. 'Twas a price of £30,000 levied on the prince's head, dead or alive, and rumours of his presence on Rasaay and Skye brought all manner of men to hunt him, including men from Dunvegan who rode daily across the Sound to Rasaay and conducted their own interrogations of the inhabitants of the Isle. My blood boiled. Interrogation, my arse. I knew full well the history books recorded the actions of the MacLeods of Dunvegan, who ingratiated themselves with the butcher as the rape of Rasaay. My hands clenched at my sides, and I chewed my lower lip furiously. The woman tilted her head at one of the men. Yes?
Was the house built back right after the war?
Och, this house has seen many changes since Culloden, including a massive reconstruction only a few years ago due to a fire that gutted everything except the west wing. I wanted to hear more. 'Twas my home she spoke of, and the things which had happened here whilst I lay on Culloden Moor. I'd spent the past 270 years bemoaning my fate, angry at both Prince Charlie and the Duke of Cumberland for their parts in the war and its aftermath. But now that I was here on Rasaay, the smell of the sea in my nose and the sight of the cool ends of sky just across the sound, a hunger gnawed inside me that defied description. I wanted more. What had happened to my family? Would I find their graves on the island, or had they left for calmer shores? I glanced at my ghostly hands, and then to the lad who seemed to be the only one who could see me. How would I find out these things? Who would talk to me? The group moved forward and received their room assignments. My attention was torn between the overwhelming strangeness of this house and the young Alex, who now seemed determined not to look at me. On an impulse, I bugged my eyes wide open and stuck my tongue out at him. The older woman motioned to him as she followed one of the men from the room. "Come on, Alex, we need to put our things away now." Alex sent a furtive look in my direction, whilst his ma, facing me directly as she beckoned him on, stared through me as if I wasn't there. If I'd had any doubts about my ghostly status, this confirmed it. They disappeared around the corner, and I turned my attention to the entry hall. Though the outer walls were of stone, as those of the original house had been, these inside walls were painted a lovely warm colour. I shook my head. Would there be anything here I recognised? Given the guide's talk earlier, I doubted that. A pang of sadness clutched my chest. 'Tis been nearly 300 years. What do you expect? I shrugged in response to my mind's unspoken question. I knew things had changed much since 1746, but my heart craved a deeper connection. Eyes wide with wonder, I ambled down the hallway, winding my way past stairways and a small, enclosed porch as I rounded yet another corner. I hurried past a room with machines for washing clothes, evidenced by the baskets of laundry. I wiped my grimy hands on my equally stained breeches as I wondered if one last pair of clean breeches and top from the washroom would be noticed. I peeked into a room with seating for a goodly number of people, broken into small table groups, and caught a whiff of food cooking. Following my nose down the now empty hall, I discovered the kitchen. No great stone fireplace met my gaze. Everything was sparkling clean and modern. Fish lay on a long table, their scales glinting silver in the overhead light. A young man cleaned each one, his knife flashing skillfully as he worked. 2 large pots simmered on a stove, aromatic smoke curling into the air above them. I grinned as my belly rumbled in response. I may not have satisfied my heart's desire, but my stomach had found familiar ground. Though the surroundings were strange, the food seemed to have changed very little. Secure in my invisible ghostly body, I strode boldly into the room, drawn by the enticing smells. Not having eaten in nearly 3 centuries, I didn't feel the need for sustenance, but my tongue fair cried out for a morsel to taste. I picked up a large spoon from beside the stove and dipped it into one of the pots. Closing my eyes, I sniffed, inhaling the spices and the richness of the broth. My smile widened at the first taste. Ma's was better, but this was very good. A dark-haired woman bustled through the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Guiltily, I set the spoon down and stepped out of her way. She sent a critical eye to the lad's work. "You need to step it up a fair bit, lad." His placid nod of agreement didn't speed his steady hands one bit, which was likely a good thing, as his knife appeared to be quite sharp. She fisted her hands on her hips, pursing her lips disapprovingly as she spied the trail of droplets on the counter. "And stay out of the soup!" I licked a bit of the savoury concoction from my lower lip and waited for a twinge of remorse for the mess. Och, it didn't come. I shrugged. The lad didn't look up from his work.
"'Twasn't me."
Cook snatched up a towel and scrubbed the counter clean. "I suppose you'll tell me it was a ghost then?" One of the corners of his lips quirked upward.
"'Twould explain a few things."
That caught my attention. A ghost? They couldn't mean me, as I was only responsible for the mess with the soup, not a few things that needed explaining. But the woman waved a dishcloth at his claim and busied herself with creating the meal. I broke off a corner of the loaf of bread cooling on the shelf and headed out the door. It wasn't hunger, but appreciation for the wonderful aroma that caused me to surrender to the fresh, crusty treat. I munched it as I meandered through the house. A couple of lasses a bit older than myself placed eating utensils and glassware on the tables in the dining room, possibly readying to serve the evening meal. I wished to be alone with my thoughts, so I didn't linger. A small room with a fireplace and a raised wooden counter drew me in for a closer look. I peered at the labels on the bottles, arranged neatly on the shelves. But my disastrous first sip of whisky a couple of days before the battle at Culloden left me with little desire to sample the liquid here, and I moved on. Eventually, I found myself on the first floor and caught sight of a set of glass doors. A small balcony nested above the front entrance to the house, fenced with a figured iron railing. An empty table and chairs beckoned, and I sat, dragging my seat around to face the view, waiting for the memories to descend. Chapter 4. The land stretched away from Rasaay House, sloping down to the sea. Evening light sparkled on the crests of the waves, their troughs already as dark as the impending night. Cattle in the field were little more than black shapes against the winter-brown grass, and the boat which brought the visitors to Rasaay House winked red and green lights as it faded across the sound. A peace, unlike any I'd known in years, settled over me, with the comfort of a well-worn plaid. I'd done nothing but returned home, and I was content. Behind me came the drawn-out whisper of fine-honed steel against leather. Frozen with the shock of recognition of the sound, my knuckles whitened on the arms of the chair. My body tensed to leap, but I couldn't move. 6 inches of metal burst through my chest just below my breastbone, the wicked blade wavering as though veiled by thin grey smoke. My hands relaxed. The sword withdrew, and I slid sidewards in my seat. A young man, likely only a few years older than me, and dressed as much as I was, in a fitted coat with tan breeches, glowered at me, sword held at a threatening angle. His frame was lean, youthful, and his shoulders wide with raw power. Dark blonde hair fell to his shoulders, a slender braid at either temple holding the mass from his face. I rubbed the heel of my hand over the spot below my breastbone in a reflexive action, not because it hurt. Steel held no threat for me now. The extra thump in my heart reflected my startled approval for the young man's fine looks. I pushed aside the unexpected attraction to the ghost. "What are you about?" The young man's gaze held mine fiercely.
"Ye aren't wanted here."
I arched a brow with slow condescension. After nearly 300 years dead on the moor, I wasn't going to take a fright at his buff. "Indeed? And ye are—" His pallid cheeks flushed slightly.
"I've been here longer. 2 ghosts aren't needed."
I gave a flippant wave of my hand, ignoring his lack of introduction. "Och, I willna be here more than a day or two, dinna fash. The tip of his sword dropped, and he took a step forward, a glimmer in his eyes.
Truth, ye can leave.
The awe in his voice betrayed the longing to escape his current fate, and I wholeheartedly sympathised. From the looks of him, he'd likely haunted the place for nearly as long as I'd been at Culloden. I motioned for him to have a seat. Shoving his sword back in its sheath, he snatched a chair and dragged it a bit closer to mine. I waved a hand about, indicating the house and glen. "How long have you been here?"
I was here when the house burned, the first time.
His face darkened, a grim tilt to his lips. My hands trembled and I leaned forward. Here was the ghost to answer my questions. My heart quickened. "Tell me everything." His scowl returned.
Why should I? I didn't know ye.
Surprised at his guardedness, and worried he'd disappear before I learned what I needed to know, I gave him my best smile. "Och, dinna let the clothes bother ye. My name's Circa. My ma was a cook here before the war." He tilted his head in surprise.
Socia, why you dressed as a lad?
I shrugged. "I wanted to go to war with my brothers. I stole away and followed them, cut my hair and donned these clothes so I wouldn't be found out. I didn't like it when they told me 'twas no place for lasses." His scowl slid effortlessly into a preen of male superiority.
And they were right. Battle is no place for a lass. How could ye manage? How could ye hold up under fire?
"I killed the first man who drew his weapon against me." 'Twas only a wee twist to the truth, for I didn't know if 'twas my shot that killed the man or not. The memory of the mounted soldier, his face obscured by a burst of blood, caused my throat to constrict, adding harshness to my words. The young man plumped back in a seat, a look of wary respect blooming across his face.
Do you want the haunting of this place?
A wee bit of amusement rumbled in his voice. Suddenly free of the vision, I threw back my head and laughed. "Nay, I haven't left the haunting of Culloden to settle here. You've naught to fear from me. I willna crowd you out." He extended his hand.
My name is Alistair. I'm happy to meet you, Socia.
His dark brown eyes, when they weren't challenging me, or in an insufferable arrogant squint, crinkled at the corners. Laugh lines, my mad called them, when she stared adoringly at my da. I grasped his hand, his fingers encircling mine in a firm grip. Something akin to warmth flared up in my arm from the point of our contact. However, 'twas no help to me. I could enjoy my last few hours on earth looking at Alistair, but 'twas not the bargain Soni and I had struck. I reluctantly pulled my hand away. "I must perform a heroic deed by this time tomorrow," I confided, determined to regain control of the conversation. "Do you know of aught amiss here?" His eyebrows furrowed in a look of concentration.
Rasaay House burnt to the ground a few years ago, but they never discovered the cause, and there's been naught amiss since. Even I didn't know what caused the place to burn.
He peered over his shoulder into the house.
Could it have something to do with one of the tourists?
It could. But how to know which one? They've all gone to their rooms, and even if they could hear me, I didn't have time to sit and chat with each one. He clapped his palms on his knees and rose.
They're likely sitting about the bar for a nip before supper. Come and I'll show ye.
Offering me his arm, in an unexpected dash of gallantry, he waited for me to come to my feet. His gesture made me suddenly aware of my stained breeches, over large worn coat, and the indescribable state of my cropped hair. I self-consciously wiped my hands down the side of my breeches before placing my fingers gently in the crook of his elbow, conscious of the difference in our appearances. Though his clothing was worn and boasted a slightly smoky aroma, He didn't sport the same grime from my trudge to Culloden and subsequent years on the muddy moor.
I can find you a kirtle and a bit of time for a wash if you're interested.
His tone was casual as we entered the house. I would have pummeled my brothers for such words, but at the moment the thought of clean clothes and a wash made me melt. I'd like that. Heat flushed my cheeks as I smiled my thanks. With a smart turn to the right, he strode off down the hall. I tagged along, trying to match my stride to his. We passed numerous doors, then, without bothering to use the latch, turned and walked through a solid portal. He nodded to the room.
Here you go. Slip out of your gear and slip into the shower. I'll be back with clean clothes in a moment.
Wait! I gripped the sleeve of his jacket as he turned away. His curious gaze returned to mine. What's a shower? Chapter 5. A grin creased Alistair's face as he stepped to a very narrow, white-walled alcove set in the side of the room. Shiny knobs were fixed on the wall, and a tube with a flared end loomed over my head. Alistair pointed inside.
Here, stand over this hole in the floor and push the wee button.
He demonstrated with a silver button set even with the wall, and water spurted from the spout overhead.
This, dear Sorsha, is a shower.
I struggled between the urge to wipe the smug look from his face and the longing to step beneath the steaming spray. Giving him a lofty shrug, I indicated his own somewhat tattered coat and wrinkled my nose at the hint of smoke. Do you not make use of it, then? The teasing smirk wiped clean from his face as the light in his eyes vanished behind a shuttered look.
I cannae wash away my past. Your clothes will be on the bed when you're finished.
Pivoting on his heel, he disappeared. Behind me the water faded to a trickle. Nay! I leapt into the shower and pressed the little silver button. To my relief, the water gushed forth again. Stripping free from my coat and breeches, I stood over a small, grated hole in the floor and let the warm water flow over me. What about Alistair's past? Could he nae forget? 'Twas clear he blamed himself for something which had rooted him in Rasaay House these long years. What memory lingered, gnawed at his soul? I stared at the shiny white wall before me. A worn chunk of what appeared to be soap sat on a small shelf. I rubbed it between my palms, pleasantly surprised at the resulting silky lather. Encouraged, I turned my attention to my hair, trying not to notice the matted strands that broke free and skittered across the floor on long, spider-like legs. The water failed again. I jabbed my thumb at the button, relieved to see the water surge once more from the spout. I rinsed quickly, satisfied with the squeak of clean hair and the pale pink of scrubbed skin just as the valve shut off for the third time. The last of the water swirled about my feet and down through the hole in the floor. Cautious, I peeked into the larger room. A large fluffy drying cloth hung from a rack close to hand. I scooped it up and blotted my hair, then wrapped it around me. The room appeared to be completely empty, no persons, ghostly or not, visible. I spied a length of fabric laying across the foot of the bed in the adjacent areas Alistair had promised. Reflecting on my rowdy escapades as a child, 'twas a bit of a wonder that I now appreciated a clean gown. The soft fabric rasped across the rough pads on my hands and snagged on a jagged nail. Biting the nail into submission, I stepped into the gown and manipulated a metal pull on an almost magical seam in the back of the dress, which closed the edges of the fabric together. Much easier than lacing. But it had no give, and no way to adjust the fit. The fabric pulled a bit too tight across the top and fell almost straight down past my knees, draping a bit loose at the waist. It was also dismayingly short, exposing a fair bit of my ankles, though I'd seen such lengths, and much shorter, on women at the visitors' centre. A wave of self-consciousness washed over me as I wondered what Alistair would think. I felt like a waif in cast-off clothing, but the dress was clean and smelled nice, and I was once again a lass. I gave a short twirl, liking the flow of the fabric. I caught sight of a reflection in a full-length mirror across the room, the first view of myself in nearly 300 years. Stepping before the glass, I studied the modern me. Black hair curled in all directions as it dried. Pale blue eyes, my brothers had often teased were fairy eyes. Ankles peeking from beneath my skirt atop bare feet. The gown's neckline scooped in an enticing manner and gathered with a narrow ruffle at the edge. The skirt was a heavy cloth I didn't recognise, but the deep blue-green colour was that of the ocean on a clear day. I grabbed the belt from my breeches and wrapped it about my waist, settling the problem of the loose fit. The weight of the dagger at my side was comforting, familiar. Viewing my reflection with a critical eye, I gave the sight of my ankles a final frown, then put the matter from my mind. I quickly ran my fingers through my hair, smoothing the wayward strands, then carefully opened the door. Alistair reclined in the hallway, back against the wall, legs stretched before him. He lunged to his feet as soon as he saw me. Shock skittered across his face, sliding into a quirk of appreciation. My heart melted, and a hint of mischievousness caused my lips to lift in response. He gave a nod.
You clean up nice for a lad.
My eyes narrowed as the mood of playfulness evaporated, and he laughed.
Come on, let's see who's in the bar. 'Twouldn't surprise me if they've already finished dining.
He arched a brow.
You dallied a wee bit in the shower.
This time I shot him a warning look, but his gaze darted away, and he whistled guilelessly as he set a rapid pace down the hall to the dining room. The rich aromas of supper grew stronger as we entered the room. A few people still dined at small tables, while the young man cleared away the dishes around them. The guests I'd seen as I entered the house had apparently finished their meal. A wave of dismay rushed over me. I didn't have all night to wait until the group met again to break their fast. My fingers twisted the fabric of my gown in frustration. Alistair must have caught my dismay.
Some will return to the bar for a nip after dinner. We'll check there.
Relieved to have another way to catch up to the guests, I followed Alistair's quick step. We entered a cosy room. A fire blazed on the hearth, and two men old enough to be my grandfather. Remembering I was still 16, no matter the passing of time, sat reading a paper at one table, a mug next to each man. A young woman curled in a comfortable chair nearby, book in her hand. Alistair and I slid unnoticed into seats in the corner of the room. A woman of an age with the two older men bustled into the room, and I leaned forward, studying her intently. She came to an abrupt stop several steps inside the door, a sudden frown on her face. Shoving a grey lock of hair from her forehead, she sighed. "Och, I can't even remember why I came in here. I must be losing my mind." She didn't appear to speak to anyone in particular that I could see. With a harumph, she whirled about and exited the room as quickly as she entered. One of the older men dropped the corner of his paper a bit and leaned to the man next to him.
Aye, she is losing her mind. She's given me a piece of it daily for the past 50 years.
The other man chortled. The first one shook his paper back into proper shape and went about to reading. Little by little, the group I'd seen earlier trickled into the bar. A man settled close to the fireplace, the amber of whiskey glowing in his glass as he set it on the table. The woman I recognised as Alex's ma sat beside him, though the lad didn't join them. A few minutes later, the other man and woman entered the room, taking spots close to the bar. A young lass poured them each a glass of deep red liquid, likely wine or claret, though I'd little idea what people drank these days. I'd often read the vast menu of food and drink available at the Culloden Visitor Centre, but so far I'd seen no such list here. Alistair gave my knee a light touch to gain my attention as he pointed to a man I hadn't noticed earlier.
See that one, there?
A frisson of awareness rippled up my leg at his touch. I shook off the distraction and followed his indication to the man on the other side of the room. His white hair was precisely combed, and his jacket lay folded neatly over the arm of his chair. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose as he made careful notations in a slim book. "Who is he?" I pitched my voice to a whisper, though 'twasn't likely anyone could hear me.
He's English by his manner and speech. Acts as though he's waiting for someone.
The harshness of Alistair's voice startled me. I didn't remark it, though. I had to find the person who needed my help. Too many possibilities ran through my mind, and I dismissed the Englishman. He could be waiting for anyone from a beautiful lover, unlikely, to a wizened old man who owed him money, more likely. I wasn't sure I wanted my heroic deed to be helping the bloody English anyway, and from Alistair's obvious disdain, neither did he. Alistair grunted.
He looks a wee bit sanctimonious, wouldn't you say?
His eyebrows shoved together above his nose in a decidedly disgruntled fashion. Aye, a bit like Lord Murray, when he set the MacDonalds and the Glengarry Regiment at the left flank on the battlefield. My stomach gave a sour twist at the memory. Surprise wiped the glower from Alistair's face.
He didn't. They've been at the king's right hand for more than 200 years.
He shook his head.
Lord Murray should have known better.
I shrugged. He wasn't best liked that day, but the left flank, as it turned out, saw little of the battle. The ground between us and the government soldiers was boggy and difficult to cross.
'Twas a boon for ye, then.
Except for those of us who got caught in the rout. I stilled Alistair's next comment with a nod to the door, as 4 braw men stomped in, earning themselves a stern look from the young woman behind the bar. They shook their heavy coats across the backs of their chairs and settled around a table in the middle of the room, taking elaborate care not to drag the chairs too noisily across the floor. The young woman rolled her eyes and sauntered to their table, a pen and paper in her hands. She took their drink preferences and left to fill their order. The men were relaxed and chatted amongst themselves, raising the noise level in the room no wee bit. One man thumped one of his friends on the shoulder.
Look, Mungo, did you sell your dog to the American or the Brit? I decided on the Brit,
Mungo admitted, with a shake to his head. The other man sat up in his chair, eyebrows arched in a perplexed look.
Nay, you didn't. The American offered you £1,000 more for that mangy sheepdog. Why'd you choose the Brit?
Mungo grinned.
'Cause the dog can't swim back from America, but he can walk home from England.
He toasted the group with his mug as the young woman served the table. They roared with laughter at his witty insight. I groaned. The Englishman snapped his little book closed and folded his eyeglasses, settling both into an inside pocket of his jacket. He rose, slipping his arms into the coat, brushing the fabric smooth, making his mark on a slip of paper the last slid across the table to him. He then stepped from the room. I lunged to my feet. Come on, let's follow him. Chapter 6. Alistair followed a scant step behind me, muttering words I ignored as we crept from the room on the Englishman's heels. His brisk stride carried him down the hall to another room where books lined the shelves and a fire burned on the hearth. Sprawled across a large cushioned chair, the lad Alex scowled at a thin black box he clutched in his hands. He sent the Englishman a quick glance, then returned his attention to the box.
The Wi-Fi isn't to our standards.
The Englishman asked. Alex shot him a rather wary look.
No, it's pretty awful.
The two were silent for a moment as the Englishman seated himself at a small table. A box of children's blocks lay tipped over in the corner, creating a colourful jumble in the otherwise staid room.
Your parents will be here in a few minutes. Is there anything you care to ask me before they arrive?
Alex pinned the Englishman with an angry glare.
Why should I talk to you? You can't make things back the way they were before.
He broke off, turning his body away with a jerk.
Alex, it isn't something we have control over. Your parents tell me you won't listen to either of them. Why is that? Because I don't want things to change.
His voice wavered, soft, bitter, and perhaps afraid. A muscle in his jaw jerked, and he blinked rapidly. My heart went out to him. Whatever was happening in his family was hitting him hard.
I'm sorry, Alex. Change in life is inevitable.
Alex's parents appeared in the doorway, snatching everyone's attention. His ma took a step into the room, and Alex lunged to his feet, pushing past her as he fled. Something harsh and indelicate rumbled low from his da. His ma's face crumpled, tears brimming in her already reddened eyes.
I assume he was uncommunicative with you as well.
Alex's dad grasped his wife's elbow and guided her to a chair.
No, James. He expressed hostility and the desire for nothing to change.
The Englishman tilted his head.
Does he know exactly what's going on? His reaction seems a bit extreme.
James and his wife exchanged a glance. She hesitated, then spoke. I've tried, but I'm afraid he doesn't let me get 2 words out before he bolts out of the room, much like now. The woman shook her head. I've been so upset since Uncle Hector died. James patted her shoulder.
Don't worry, Alice. Alex will come around.
He squared his shoulders and addressed the Englishman.
We wanted to include him in our decision to move here, but we can't seem to pin him down for a discussion. Everything happened so quickly. I've worked long hours to get my business to a point where I can leave for a few weeks. We wanted to come here, check things out, and really hoped Alex would learn to love the place.
Not likely, I snorted. Alex didn't seem to be embracing the move to Scotland. But why was he so troubled? I tugged Alistair's sleeve. Come on, let's talk to Alex. I slipped cautiously from the room, though stealth was hardly necessary. Alistair followed. Not far down the hall, I caught sight of the lad. Luck was with me, for I'd truly no idea which way he'd gone. Alex! Alistair grabbed my arm and pulled me into the recess of a doorway. He glowered.
He isn't he? You're a good deed.
Why not? Alistair peered around the doorframe.
He's English.
I'd heard many voices during my years on Culloden Moor. I suspected Alex and his ma were American, though I didn't have time to sort this out with Alistair. He doesn't sound English to me, but it doesn't matter. He's a troubled lad. I didn't have control over who may need my help. You mustn't interfere.
Well, we'll not be helping the bloody English.
His normally pallid face took on a ruddy hue. You can help me or nae. It's up to you. But you cannae make my decision for me. Alex is a braw lad, and I believe he needs my help. Alistair's grip on my arm tightened, and I jerked at the pressure. Alistair released his grasp and rubbed the heel of his hand across the back of his neck in a frustrated gesture.
I dunna like it.
I rested the tips of my fingers on his cheek, the muscles of his clenched jaw twitching beneath my touch. You can tell me the why of it later, but I need to speak to the lad now. Giving me a grudging nod, Alistair stepped into the hall.
Alex.
The lad glanced over his shoulder and slowed to a halt.
Who are you?
Curiosity rippled across his face. Come with us. We'll explain. I motioned for him to follow. Alex's eyes narrowed suspiciously, and he didn't move.
I saw you earlier today, but my mum didn't. Am I the only one who can see you?
I grinned, pleased to note his glimmer of interest. I believe so. We'd like to help you. His look darkened, his body slumped, despondent.
You can't. No one can.
I softened my voice. Can you tell us why? Alex glanced up and down the hall. 'Twas empty, but that was hardly guaranteed for any length of time, nor did it seem a comfortable or inviting place for a chat.
On the balcony, where 'tis quiet this time of day.
Alistair made the suggestion gruffly, his dark, hooded eyes telling me plainly he still didn't like it. Shoving his hands into his pockets, Alex shrugged and followed us to the small area over the front entry, where Alistair and I had met only a couple of hours earlier. Alex leaned over the railing.
I can hear the ocean.
Aye, 'tis too dark to see now, but in the morning you can see across the water to Skye, and to the Cuilleens rising up. He faced me, the light from Rasaay House chasing away the shadows on his face.
What are Cullens and why you say Rasaay and not Rasaay?
I laughed. I say Rasaay because I was born here, and 'tis how we say it. As for the Cuilleens, they are the large mountain range on the Isle of Skye. Alistair scowled.
They can be dangerous for inexperienced hikers.
Alex perked up.
I can climb. I'll bet I can do it.
Alistair leaned closer, a warning look on his face.
At the bottom of the Cullens lies Loch Corrusk, and in those deep, dark waters lives a Kelpie.
His voice dropped dramatically. I rolled my eyes. Lads. Alex's attention fixed eagerly on Alistair's words.
What's a Kelpie?
Alistair glanced around, as though he feared he'd been overheard. Alex slid into the chair next to Alistair, hanging on his every word. Alistair drew back slightly, seeming to loathe to come in contact with the English lad.
A Kelpie is a monster that often appears as a beautiful horse, haunting rivers or lochs.
I cringed at the word haunting, but Alistair never missed a beat.
Sometimes they appear as a beautiful woman, luring ye to your death.
Young Alex gulped, his eyes wide.
Death? Aye. Whether he appears as a tame pony to a wee lad such as yourself, or as a wondrous horse, the Kelpie has a magical hide that, if touched, ye canna release.
Alistair warmed to his tale.
Once he's captured ye, he'll drag ye beneath the water and eat ye.
His final pronouncement was delivered with a flare, his eyes flashing. Alex startled backward in his chair. He shot me an uncertain look.
For real?
I shrugged, trying to dispel the fright Alistair had given the lad. How else to explain the wee bairns who go missing by the loch? I confess I've not seen one, though. Alex's voice cracked.
No chance to get away, then?
Alistair gave a negligent shrug.
Look, if you can catch him by his bridle, he'll become as tame as the parson's fat cat. But best of luck to ye. The last lad who tried to catch a Kelpie's bridle touched the head of the beast as well, and he had to cut off 2 of his fingers to get away.
Alistair, 'tis enough. Alex rallied from the frightful tale and pointed at me.
Weren't you dressed as a soldier earlier, like him?
You're a canny lad. I sent Alistair a look that said, I told you so. From the scowl he sent me, I decided he didn't take the reminder well. I switched my attention to Alex with a reassuring grin. Even my brothers didn't recognise me.
So you're from a reenactment group, right?
Alex's excitement turned doubtful.
But why can't anyone else see you? And why do you sometimes appear blurry? Like you're not really there.
Alistair and I remained silent. I wasn't sure how the lad would respond when he learned we were ghosts. Alistair, I'm sure, simply didn't wish to speak further to the lad. Alex's hands gripped the arms of his chair and gave a nervous laugh.
I guess this is where you tell me you're ghosts.
I flashed Alistair a warning look to keep him from launching into another horrifying tale. He leaned back in his chair, one eyebrow quirked upward.
I'll grant ye he's perceptive.
He pinned me with a stare.
For an Englishman.
I frowned. I would get to the bottom of Alistair's problem later, but at the moment, young Alex needed someone to confide in. Who better to spill your secrets to than a couple of ghosts no one else could see? Aye, Alex, we're ghosts. Alistair has had the haunting of Rasaay House for many years. My name is Circa, and I arrived the same time you did today. To Alex's credit, he didn't flinch, but rather eyed us both with curiosity.
How old are you?
I'm 16. I gave Alistair a questioning look.
20.
He grunted.
Whoa, you're not much older than me.
Alex gave me a nod.
I'm gonna be 12 soon.
12? I had a sister your age many years ago. A curious pricking sensation bothered my eyes, and I blinked, surprised to find tears near the surface.
When?
Alex broke off. His cheeks reddened. When did we die? I thought I'd help him along with the difficult questions. He nodded. I died in 1746, after a great battle near Inverness. How well do you know your Scottish history? He shrugged.
Not very well, really.
I got to Alistair's scowl and decided to hurry the conversation along. Never mind then. Alistair, how long have you haunted the house?
You know very well I died the same year ye did.
He growled. Giving up on any hope of Alistair's show of goodwill toward Alex, I faced the lad and smiled. Alex, we saw you talking to the Englishman earlier. Then you rushed from the room when your parents arrived. Can you tell us what has you so upset? He stared at me. He stared at his feet. His gaze slid past Alistair and into the night.
You won't tell anyone?
Nay, we only wish to help. You can trust us. A corner of his lips quirked upward.
I guess there's no one for you to tell, is there?
Canny lad, I repeated with a grin. Right now, we're your best friends. Chapter 7. Alex drew a deep breath.
My dad wants to move here.
I sensed this wasn't the entire tale, so I didn't take offence that the lad clearly had no current fondness for my homeland. Alistair harumphed. I shushed him. What about your ma? Alex's gaze cut away.
I don't think she'll be coming.
I tried to recall what the woman had said earlier. Why not? It seems to me she didn't say different when your dad mentioned looking the place over. Scotland, I mean. Alistair surged out of his chair and strode into the house, his faint shadow falling onto the balcony from his new seat just inside the door. Alex buried his face in his hands. I patted his shoulder. Dinna fash, Alex. It can't be as bad as that. His voice filtered through his fingers.
They're getting a divorce.
A what? Such a thing was never spoken of in my time. Mayhap people did things differently now. Alex straightened, wiping his sleeve across his face with a sigh.
I know it's all true because she's been so weepy lately, and my dad hasn't been home hardly at all. My friend Tom at school said that's how it started with his parents.
And the Englishman?
He's here to help with some papers. I think they call him a solicitor or something. My dad is from England, though we've lived in the States since I was born. I think Mr. Smith's in charge of moving and the divorce and stuff.
I bit my lip, thinking hard. I could easily sympathise with the lad. Though I'd lost my da when I was but 8 summers, he'd died in a storm off the coast, not in a deliberate separation. There was a bitterness in the house for quite some time afterward, as Ma had argued with him against going out that day. He'd left her with 4 children to care for, and several years passed before she remarried and birthed my youngest brother and sister. 'Twas clear Alex felt his family being torn apart ended things with as much finality as death. To try to live with parents so far apart would be a difficult task. I couldn't see a way for me to keep his ma and da together, given the short time I had left. But mayhap I could ease Alex's worst fears. The healing would have to come from his parents. Have you told them how you feel? From what his parents had said earlier, I knew he hadn't, and wondered why. He picked at his trousers leg.
No, I don't want to hear them say it's over between them. I don't want to have to pick sides.
Is it any less real when you didn't hear the words? He sighed.
Maybe, no. But I don't know how to start.
I'd think if you'd stay put for more than a moment, they'd talk to you. From what I saw and heard after you darted from the room, I think they're ready to discuss things. Alex wrinkled his nose.
I don't want to be like my friend Tom. He says his dad doesn't have time for him anymore. He only sees him twice a month for a weekend.
A muscle in his jaw twitched, and I suspected he battled back tears. You're a braw lad, who'll find a way to keep you and your dad close. This can't be easy for them either.
Yeah.
He kicked the leg of the chair opposite him.
Why can't they just work things out?
I placed my palm on his knee. Lad, 'tis nae always easy to know the why of someone else's life. Go talk to them, Alex. Not knowing is eating it alive. Alex nodded.
Yeah. Kind of like having to take a medicine everyone says is really vile. You don't really know till you taste it, right?
And the taking of it might make you better, aye? I was relieved to see the rigid line of his shoulders relax.
Maybe,
he admitted, though his eyes remained worried. He shuffled to his feet and sighed.
I think I'll go see if they're still in the room.
He glanced up at me.
No one else knows about you, right?
I cannae say about Alistair, but I haven't seen anyone else take notice of me. Alex lifted a hand in a hesitant wave, then re-entered the house through the balcony doors. I watched him step inside, then waited for Alistair to return. I fisted my hands on my hips. Alistair gave the lad a wide berth as they passed in the doorway, but Alex didn't seem to notice. What's your problem with the lad? My voice bit a mite sharper than I intended. Alistair gave me a startled look.
What do you mean?
Och, don't he look all innocent? You didn't wish to help him, and you told him a horrible tale about the kelpie that haunts the loch, frightening him. He's only a lad. You didn't have to be so cruel. Alistair scowled.
When I woke almost 300 years ago smelling of smoke and no longer with the living, I swore revenge on all the English.
I calmed. As much as Alex needed to talk to his parents, Alistair needed to get something off his chest too. Would you tell me of it? Even in the dim light, I saw his skin flush, and his hand crept up to rub the back of his neck in a gesture that was becoming familiar to me. I took his hand, the warmth of it surprising. With a look of wonder, Alistair stared at me, his dark brown eyes warm, assessing. He cradled my hand in his, feeling a desire in me to have him wrap his arms about me, much as his fingers now embraced my hand.
It doesn't matter about me. Tell me of the war.
His voice rumbled low and gruff. He cleared his throat. Recognising a procrastination when I heard one, I gave him a narrow look. Why would you ask about that? He shrugged.
I didn't leave home and family to follow the prince, and I'd like to hear why a lass such as yourself did.
Did you nae support him?
Would that bother ye?
I considered his question. Nay, it may have once, but it's been too long. I no longer harbour the dreams and prejudices I once did.
Tell me about it.
We seated ourselves in the cushioned chairs, fingers still entwined. The sensation was a novel one for me, tingling and soothing at the same time. I'd been scarcely old enough to be courted when I left home, and few lads were brave enough to think of courting a lass who preferred breeches to skirts, and who could outshoot them with a bow and arrow. I left my hand in Alistair's grip, reluctant to end our contact. My brothers made it sound so grand, and I waved my free hand about in a vague gesture, unable to put my thoughts into words. 'Twas something larger than my life here, middle child, and a lass at that, passed over, unless there was some chore to do or some devilry my brothers needed a scapegoat for.
Your brothers picked on ye.
Curiously, Alistair's voice sounded half teasing, half protective. I laughed, remembering the pair of them fondly. Oh, aye, they did. My two younger sisters likely became perfect wives, always helping around the house, and with my wee baby brother. I didn't care about such things. I wanted to shoot a bow and arrow, throw a knife, run, and climb trees better than my brothers, and they let me follow them about as long as I didn't tell Ma about their adventures. Alistair's teeth flashed white in the faint light, and I continued. When they left to fight for the prince, I cropped my hair and stole a set of breeches and jacket. I pocketed my knife and a half-loaf of bread from the evening meal, and set out, determined to join them on the battlefield. His brow furrowed.
They did not to stop ye.
They didn't know I followed them. They taught me to track, so 'twas no problem following them. And while it took much longer than I'd suspected, I was too stubborn to quit. They'd met up with the others, headed to Inverness to join the Jacobite cause, and I stole into camp late one night, exhausted and hungry. A man I befriended told me I reminded him of the son he lost in an earlier battle. It gave me some of his food and a pistol he'd taken from a government soldier. Memories surfaced, my chest tightened, breath harsh, and I steeled myself against the onslaught of emotion. Though I declared otherwise, too little had changed since that fateful day. I didn't care that Alistair hadn't fought for the prince. I cared deeply, however, that so many had lost their lives at Culloden that day and in the weeks following. Lord George Murray placed us on the left flank. The men were affronted, angry to lose their traditional pace on the king's right, a spot given to the Macdonalds by Robert the Bruce himself 450 years before. I'd taken a position with the Glengarry Regiment, men under the Duke of Perth's command. Lord Murray's order put the Duke in a difficult position, struggling to contain the disgruntled soldiers who buzzed like a hive of angry bees. I closed my eyes, envisioning the moor as the sun dispatched the icy morning mists. We'd stood in our ranks, sinking deeper and deeper in the frigid, swampy ground, awaiting the command from the prince. Sunlight winked on the Hanoverian bayonets and cannons as I checked my pistol and sword with a shaking hand. War was not what I'd expected. We waited for word to attack. Through sleet and wind mixed with periods of sunshine, we watched the government army from up across the moor. They fired at us and I saw men fall. The Jacobites grumbled as no word came to move. When the command finally came, I wiped my nose on the sleeve of my coat and took a step forward, my legs shaking so badly I could hardly walk. My legs trembled in response to the memory. The smell of smoke and blood mingled with the cloying odour of the churned boggy ground rose to choke me. Alistair tugged at my hand, moving me from the cold chair to the warmth of his lap. With his arms wrapped protectively around me, I breathed deeply, instantly losing the fear of the memory.
Easy, Socia. You're safe now.
I nodded, gaining strength. We slogged forward, the ground sucking and pulling at our feet, icy water reaching halfway up our legs, filling our boots until our feet were too numb to feel the cold. English soldiers in the line opposite us fired, and men around me crumpled to the ground in agony. I discharged my pistol, and a man across from me fell from his horse.
You're shot?
I paused, distracted from my tale by the tingle in my blood that wasn't from the crisp, cold air. Mayhap. I truly didn't know whose shot killed him. 'Twas certainly my intent to do so, though it cost me the little bit I'd eaten earlier to see it done. Alistair smoothed my hair.
'Tis not uncommon for the bravest man to be sickened by death. What happened next?
As we ran out of ammunition, men reached for swords, axes, scythes, whatever they had. But the murky ground before us was now a swamp, and we halted. For a few minutes, the men resorted to hurling insults at the government soldiers, who were as stuck in the mire as we were. They eventually pulled back to seek a better enemy to engage, and we turned to view the whole of the battle. I buried my face in his jacket, breathing in the sweet mix of smoke and something that was peculiarly Alistair. 'Twas too late to change our position. The Jacobite line to our right had been overwhelmed. Men scrambled about, fleeing the field. Royal dragoons crossed the boggy ground, cutting down Jacobite soldiers without mercy. There was nothing I could do to help. Smoke from the cannon and guns surrounded us. I could no longer see my brothers. "Run, lad." A man I didn't know had grabbed my arm, jerking me out of my helplessness. I struggled to keep pace, my boots churning through water red with blood. I stumbled and fell, scrambled to my feet. The whisper of steel and the thud of hooves surrounded me, filling my head. Gunfire crackled and men grunted with the effort of hand-to-hand combat, keening in mortal pain. No further words were forthcoming. I could not relive the moment I died. Mayhap I was wrong. I didn't wish to recall it further. He nodded.
I will nae ask it of you then.
My breathing eased. For long moments, Alistair simply held me as my past faded. I pressed my cheek against his chest. "Tell me what happened here." Chapter 8. His grip on my fingers tightened, then loosened. I slid back to my chair. He leaned forward and shoved his hands between his knees.
I didn't follow Chief MacLeod when he left Rasaay for war. My wife had just died in childbirth, her second born, and I couldn't bear to be parted from the wee Duncan.
"Your son?" He nodded.
'Twas difficult to know what to do. The urge to do my duty as a soldier for the chief was strong, but he had nothing but kind words for me that day, the day before he set out for Inverness.
"You knew him?"
Aye. He offered to have Duncan stay here at Rasaay House, where he could be cared for by his wife and others, but his ma's loss was too fresh, and I hesitated.
He drew a deep breath.
My decision was finally made to follow the chief and his men, but 2 days after I left Duncan at Rasaay House, word came of the defeat at Culloden. I came back.
Was he well? I could hardly breathe for the catch in my chest as I awaited the next part of his story.
Aye, though a bit ill from Grayton after I left. The chief's lady wife suggested he and I stay here until the men returned, but we soon learned there were many who'd ne'er return.
Hugh MacLeod's fell that day at Culloden.
Not all who didn't return died at Culloden. The government marked all who were Jacobite supporters, captured a few, killed more.
Leaving many here to fend for themselves? It was a statement, one I'd learned in my determination to discover my family's fate.
What do you know of what followed?
Och, I've haunted the Culloden Visitor Centre for the past 270 years. There isn't much I didn't know. I paused, the familiar sensation of dread pooling deep inside. Except what happened to my family. Did you know them?
Mayhap. In the weeks after Culloden, most of us on Rasaay banded together as the English did their best to destroy us, whilst they searched for the prince.
My ma's name was Tavia, and she had 3 wee ones. My sister, Fiona, and the 2 youngest. Fiona was 12 summers, the bairns 5 and 3. Alistair's look turned introspective.
That was her name. I remember it. She was here in the beginning. Her husband.
My stepdad. Alistair nodded acknowledgement.
He took her away to America, her and the lasses, though I was already dead.
I pounced on the statement as his voice trailed off. What do you mean, the lasses? What about my wee baby brother? Shrill-voiced, my words betrayed my concern. Alistair caught my gaze.
He asked earlier about me using the shower for myself.
I recalled his earlier statement and wondered what it had to do with my wee brother. You said you couldn't wash away your past.
Are you sure you need to know?
Need to know. Such a different question from did I want to know. My head screamed at me to tell him no, that I didn't want to hear another word about his past. My heart thudded slowly, full of trepidation. For centuries, I'd worried about my family, begged God to know what had happened to them. Now, I feared it was too painful to know the certainty, and opened my mouth to tell him I wished to speak of other things. But the empty place in my heart pulled at me, pled with me to give it knowledge and closure. I want to know, Alistair, if you can tell me.
I can know the tale, aye. Can I tell it? I didn't know.
His face fell, and shadows lined his face, turning him into an old man, wrung with bitterness. He stared over my shoulder.
The twa wee bairns, my Duncan and your brother Callum, often played together. The older of your 2 sisters, or another lass, having the keeping of them, whilst your ma and I did our jobs. 'Twas a terrible time, the summer of '46. Men who'd gone to war for the prince were often captured on their way home and imprisoned, fined or worse. Part of the troubles were because the Duke of Cumberland wished to not only teach the Highlanders a lesson they'd never forget, but to destroy us completely. His men were turned loose to root out the Jacobites in any manner they saw fit, looting, burning, rape, murder, men, women and children. It didn't matter, and there were few men here to protect them. The worst was the price on Prince Charles's head.
Why was that worse? I didn't understand. Was the carnage and mayhem not enough?
The MacLeods of Dunvegan didn't join the prince, and that helped protect many of us from the butchery, for a while. But the Duke didn't want the prince to escape, and he set a price of £30,000 on his head, and rumours spread like wildfire of his whereabouts.
Dread, charged and tangible, sparked around us. What happened?
The MacLeods on Rasaay were known to have sided with the prince, and 'twas believed he had taken refuge here. Men, lads, anyone able to guide a boat to the isle came in search, partly to curry favour with the king's men, partly because of the Isle feud. At first they simply harassed us. When they didn't find the prince, the scoundrels took to looting. When we protested, they stole or slaughtered our cattle and sheep, and burned our houses, leaving us to die in the cold, or sometimes in the houses they fired.
I swallowed past a painful lump in my throat. Everything I'd read or heard was being shown as truthful. I'd feared it to be so, prayed it wasn't. Minutes or hours passed. Alistair at last drew a deep breath.
At the end of June that year, the prince fled from Southwest to Skye with the help of Flora MacDonald. A few days later he landed on Rasaay. He wasn't here long before he headed to the mainland, But the Duke sent his man, Captain Ferguson, a man with a well-earned reputation for cruelty, to track the prince from his landing point on Skye. He didn't find the prince, and from his ship anchored off the coast of Rasaay, Ferguson allowed his men to run wild on our island. Their presence increased the violence. In the end, they left the beaten, homeless people to starve, and they burned Rasaay House. The wee lads were playing in the garden that day. Soldiers from Ferguson's ship, the HMS Furnace, marched to the house, their wagon loaded with gunpowder. Some dragged the barrels inside, others took lumber and nails to hammer the windows and doors closed. The noise frightened the lads. The lass who watched them had been taken away by a soldier, leaving them unattended. The lads ran inside. I arrived and searched the garden for them, fought with the soldiers who taunted me with lies of the lads' whereabouts. Finally, Duncan called to me from an upstairs window, but then the house was in flames.
I covered my ears, but the shrieks I heard in my head were nae earthly sounds. They rose from somewhere deep inside me, memories of men who were only moments away from departing this world, and I couldn't close them out. A hand gripped my shoulder, firm but gentle, and warmth built beneath his palm. Alistair gently moved my hands from my ears.
Breathe.
I inhaled sharply, filling my lungs with crisp night air as the ghostly noises faded. After a moment, Alistair stood and stepped away, leaving me alone on the chair. He hunched his shoulders and stared at the night sky. Rising, I crossed on shaky legs to stand behind him as cold tears slid down my face. Placing my cheek against his shoulder, I hugged him tight, and the hollowness inside faded as we shared our grief. He sighed.
"'Tis why I cannae wash away my past. I wasnae strong enough to save both lads. I fought through to the floor where I'd seen the lads. Duncan ran to me, and I carried him outside, leaving him in another's care. I never found your brother, Saoirse."
He ground the heels of his palms against both sides of his head, as though to drive the memory out.
I searched and called, but I never saw him again. I still search for him, but I can never find him.
My heart splintered to pieces inside my chest. I couldn't speak, couldn't see for the tears blinding me. Alistair took my hand and pulled me against his chest, propping his chin on top of my head. We stood there for long moments, arms about each other, seeking a solace that seemed terribly far away. Finally, he released me.
"And 'tis why, dear Saoirse, I cannae help ye save your English lad."
Chapter 9. His hand slid down my arm, lingering for an instant on my fingers before breaking contact. "It doesn't have to be like this, Alistair. The English," he hushed me, with a finger to my lips.
"I cannae erase my past, and I cannae tell you how much it pains me to know I failed ye."
And with those words he vanished. A sense of loss and uncertainty settled over me beyond anything I'd experienced before. I'd hopefully coaxed a reluctant lad into a reconciliation with his parents, but it didn't seem to be the focus of my heroic deed. I wasn't certain what I'd expected, but there was no sense of grand accomplishment, albeit reconciliation being no small matter. There was something more. I knew it. Was there a guest I'd neglected? Should I have paid more attention to Alex's parents? Should I follow Alex and make certain he did as I asked? Resting my palms on the railing, I stared into the night. Like coloured mists, night lights streaked the sky, slanting to the earth from above. Stories of the light from my childhood lightened my mood, and I smiled. Were there really spirits engaged in battle, as my brothers had told me? Red was the colour of war and bloodshed. I eyed the sky warily. Blue, green and yellow danced a languorous path across the night, but nary a hint of red appeared. Ma had whispered the lights were the dancing spirits of children who died during childbirth. Mayhap they were the lights of any child who died young. Mayhap wee Callum looked down on me from heaven and sent the lights as a comfort. I flexed my fingers, then closed my fists, missing the contact of Alistair's hand in mine. So much despair in his soul, yet he made me feel whole, confident, alive. My mind told me to find Alex, be certain he was getting the help he needed from his parents, but my heart bade me search for Alistair. And yet, my heroic deed was for the living, aye? I couldn't change the past for Alistair, but I could possibly point young Alex toward a better future. My fists tightened as I struggled with my decision, fingernails digging into my palms. I liked the English little better than Alistair did, though the war hadn't been English against the Scot, and 'twas even said Prince Charlie scarcely had a true yen for the Scottish throne. It had been the English crown he'd set his eye on, hoping for both. There had been Scots and Englishmen on both sides of the moor, as well as Irish and French soldiers, and I couldn't say whose bullet ended my life that day. My hatred fell on the butcher and his ilk for his atrocities against the innocent, and my frustrated ire rested squarely on the prince's dandified shoulders. Beyond that, things weren't so clear to me, but I hadn't witnessed the violence perpetuated on the people of Rasaay those months after Culloden as Alistair had. If spoken and written accounts of the events caused me such pain, how much worse for Alistair, who lived and died with it all. The dancing lights faded from view, leaving the twinkle of pale stars against the black sky. Even if my wee brother Callum's spirit looked down on me, he'd shed no light on how I was to proceed. I felt lost and insignificant, and my time here would soon be up. I breathed one last lungful of the briny sea air and trudged back inside the house. Silence echoed in the empty hallways. Voices drifted from the bar. I peered inside as I passed the open door. The number of patrons at the middle table had grown, their actions jovial, no doubt fueled by the liquid spirits which had once filled the numerous bottles littering the tabletops. One braw man good-naturedly shoved the shoulder of the smaller man next to him.
The lass asked wee Jimmy here if he wanted to play a round, and do you know what this madman said?
A few ribald comments bounced back and forth as the larger man shook his head mournfully.
Nay, wee Jimmy looked at her big blue eyes and all her points of interest and said, I didn't know there was a golf course nearby.
Laughter boomed, and the poor man at the butt of the joke reddened and took a large gulp of his drink. Men. I hurried down the hall, leaving the drunken loons behind. I wished for a way to discover which room Alex and his parents were in, but I hadn't seen a ledger in the lobby, and the how of a computer wasn't a skill I'd learned in the past 270 years. I'd seen them in use at the Culloden Visitor Centre, but neglected to ask for instruction. Voices murmured through the closed door, but not distinct enough to put a face to the sound. A man's dark form strolled toward me, but it wasn't until he passed a sconced light that I recognised Alex's da. He halted 2 rooms from me, and the door snatched open as he put a hand to the latch. I caught a glimpse of Alex's ma, before his da stepped past her into the room. Did you find him? She asked, her voice tight and worried. James murmured a short word as he pulled the door closed.
No.
I scurried to the doorway, intent on stepping ghost-like through the closed portal as Alistair and I had earlier, and crashed into the solid wood. Shite! Cupping my nose in my palm as tears pooled in my eyes, I waited for the sting to go away.
There's something you should know about the rooms.
I spun about, catching sight of Alistair, leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Even through tear-blurred vision, his broad shoulders and lean waist made my heart flutter. What are you doing here? I was a wee bit disgruntled with him still for leaving me alone earlier. His face took on a faraway expression.
I was looking.
His voice trailed off, and he gave himself a shake.
You can't enter if the room's tenant is inside.
I blinked. What? He shrugged.
'Twasn't always so. When I first began haunting, I was free to come and go as I please. But when the new house was built a few years ago, that changed. 'Tis as if the newness doesn't accept the old ways.
I ignored the gloominess of his explanation. How do I get in?
You must wait.
I stomped my foot, frustration shooting through my body. I wanted to speak to Alex, and from what I just heard, he's missing. Flinging myself back against the wall, I slid down until I plopped to the floor, my mind working furiously. If his parents didn't know where he was, eavesdropping on their conversation would likely give me scant clues to his whereabouts. I only have a day left, I muttered irritably, wishing I knew just what it was I was supposed to do to win my boon.
Only a day?
An anxious tone laced Alistair's voice. I swallowed past a sudden lump in my throat. I told you I didn't want the haunting of Rasaay House. I have a day, mayhap less now, to do a heroic deed and be gone forever. I lifted my gaze to his, wondering at the misty quality of his face. I blinked, and the view cleared. Hours have already passed, and I fear I'll fail. Alistair dropped his gaze and shoved his hands into his jacket pockets.
I didn't want you to leave. 'Tis lonely here, and the novelty of haunting the place wore off a couple 100 years ago.
Do you need a dog, then, to keep you company? I'll admit to a sharp edge to my voice, but I didn't want to hear he was lonely. I wanted him to want me, not just a bit of company. Though it could scarcely matter beyond tomorrow, my heart was still young, and I'd no chance for romance beyond the dream of glory on the prince's behalf. Something in Alistair's presence, his teasing quality, blended with a gentle protectiveness, made me wish for a different outcome to Soni's intrigues. To his credit, a hint of red stained the ghostly pallor of his cheeks, and he met my gaze squarely.
Nay, I've developed a fondness for ye, mayhap more. You've a kind heart and a way of taking your own initiative that I admire. I didn't know what I missed until you arrived.
'Tis why you stuck your sword in my gullet, then? I laughed, pleased to find my attraction to him wasn't one-sided.
'Twas before I knew ye.
I thought to point out he'd likely wish to do it again were we able to remain together for long, as I was more opinionated than he was aware. Alistair opened his mouth, but I shushed him with a raised finger. A voice, testy and loud enough to penetrate the closed door to my right, filtered through.
I'm quite sure spotty Wi-Fi is acceptable to you. However, I must have access to some sort of internet now.
The Englishman's voice slid through the walls with only a slightly muffled quality. Alistair leaned closer, his ear to the panel. There was a momentary pause.
I will be down immediately, and will expect to have this remedied.
There was a scrape, as of a chair sliding across the floor, and footsteps marched briskly across the room. Instinctively, I pulled my feet out of the way as the door was wrenched open and the Englishman charged through, yanking on his vest in a decidedly agitated attempt to make himself presentable. He slammed the door closed and jerked once on the handle. Satisfied with the latch, he shoved his wee speaking box into his pants pocket and strode past the two of us without pause. I stared at his retreating back as he stormed down the hall, pitying whoever would be on the receiving end of his displeasure. Alistair tugged hard on my hand, and I jerked my gaze to his.
He's left his coat in the room, and whatever is in that wee notebook of his, I dinna know what's in it, but it may give you answers.
Needing no further urging, I faded with ghostly ease through the closed portal, Alistair following soundlessly a step behind. A lamp glowed brightly in one corner of the room, next to a small desk. My heart raced as I spied the jacket draped over the back of the wooden ladder-back chair beside the table. I sank onto the soft cushion tied to the woven seat, scarcely noticing as Alistair pulled the chair out for me. I thanked him with a brief nod, my attention focused on finding the book that could hold the key to young Alex's future. I patted the jacket, encountering a stiff object beneath the folds. Reaching inside the front lapels, I removed the small leather-bound book the man had written in earlier. I grinned. This is it?
Open it.
Laying the book on the table, I opened the front cover. I ran my finger down the lines of the page, looking for a mention of young Alex or his parents.
What does it say?
I gave him a cross look over my shoulder at the interruption. He shrugged.
I dinna read so well.
Well, I've honed my skills in the last couple of centuries. Give me a minute to find something of interest. I flipped to the next page, struggling to decipher the thin, spidery writing. 3 pages in, I tapped the book with my forefinger. This isnae note for a divorce. At least I dinna think so. 'Tis the directions to move Mr. and Mrs. James Donovan and their son, Alex, to a place called Sea Manor.
Sea Manor's a fair-sized house up the coast just a bit, overlooking the bay. But how does this help?
I let out a frustrated sigh. I'm nae sure, but at last Alex will nae have to worry about his parents separating. I glanced at the window, an echo of my reflection staring back at me from the dark pine. Do you think he'd leave the house this late at night? A frown creased Alistair's face.
One Englishman less is no concern of mine.
His gaze slid uneasily from mine. You cannae mean that. A life is a life.
Not on Rasaay, not after what they did.
His jaw clenched stubbornly, and he squared his shoulders against my protests. I scrambled to my feet. He is a child. Alistair turned away.
So was your brother.
I stared after him, conflicting emotions roiling inside me. How could the man be so kind and helpful to me and so absolutely pig-headedly opposed to anything he considered English? Could he not simply see past the label, beyond the horrors of the past? Alistair strode to the door, then paused with a short glance over his shoulder.
Alex left through the side door in the direction of the beach.
Chapter 10. Bitter, stinging wind tore past me, whipping the short ends of my hair about my cheeks as I stepped through the closed door of Rasaay House and peered into the inky night. What had been a pleasant, if chilly, evening was now the leading edge of a winter storm. Men who'd warmed themselves with the whisky and cheer of the house's bar and fireplace slipped past me into the darkness, bundled against the hint of sleet. I wrapped my arms about myself, noticing the cold, but not truly discomforted by it. 'Twas more of a sympathetic gesture for the poor souls out in this disagreeable weather. And now 'twas more important than ever I find young Alex and coax him back to the house. Even bundled up, he wouldn't last long without shelter and a fire. But which way had he gone? Alistair had said the lad had headed toward the beach, and I snorted. As Rasaay is an island, beach accounts for a good portion of the terrain. Setting my back to the wind, and with no more decision than that, I headed along the coast in a southeasterly direction. If it hadn't been filled in the past years, a small cave wasn't too far away. 'Twas called Uavnan Rav, The oar cave, and many a boatman and pirate had hidden the oars to his wee boat in this makeshift space formed centuries ago by covering the space between two rocks so that it blended into the surrounding landscape. As I trudged up the coastline, I considered other places Alex could have gone. Had he arrived with a desire to explore the island, there were any number of fascinating sights I remembered from my childhood. Duncan, our tallest peak. Dunborodale, a broch built centuries before I was born, its exact use likely a mystery still. The spring on the east side of the island that shoots out from a tall rock on a high ledge and whose waters leave behind a solidified white substance. Lime, I think they call it. Brochel Castle, where the MacLeod ruled until 1621, when the MacLeod built Kilmalloig Castle, moving his home to the southern part of the island, which had been largely a den of pirates. Admittedly, that would fascinate most lads, but the going was over marked and unmarked tracks, not to mention a hike of several hours, and not something to undertake at night or in such weather. Upon reflection, the oar cave seemed the likely place. A blast of cold air cut through my dress, reminding me my kirtle didn't protect me as well as my trousers and coat, and if I had not been a ghost, things wouldn't be going well for me at this point. I put the wintry wind from my mind as I slipped on an ice-glazed stone. I need to find Alex, soon. The wind whipped past, bringing the smell of snow and pine. I shook my hair out of my face and peered at the landscape before me. A slice of darkness, blacker than night, caught my eye. Something flashed like the wink of a star. Small, quickly gone. But stars didn't glimmer on the stones on this night. I crept closer. Behind me, clouds raced across the moon, giving light almost as quickly as 'twas taken away. The opening to the cave shone momentarily in the moonlight, and the light flashed again. Alex? I frowned as the wind whipped my words away. This time the light burst against the night and stayed. I hurried forward, hands before me to warn of anything in my path. I barked my shins against a large rock, but it caused no more than a moment's hesitation. Reaching the cave, I found Alex perched on top, one leg dangling outside, the other in recess between the rocks. In his hand he held the black box I'd seen him playing with earlier. This time, the entire screen a white glow. Relieved as I was to find him, I still scolded. "You'll die of exposure out here, Alex. Come with me at once." I held out my hand, half angry with the risk he'd put himself in, half relieved to find the lad in no worse condition. A grimace crossed his face.
I can't.
He angled the light screen at the roof of the cave, showing where his leg disappeared into the depths.
I'm stuck.
Skirts whipped around my legs as the wind strengthened. I circled to the rear of the cave and peered over Alex's shoulder. The roof had given way, and one of the slabs of rock pinned him tight. "Is your leg injured?" He shrugged.
It hurts, but I can't feel it much anymore.
I put my hands to the boulder's edges and tugged. The only thing that moved was a bit of hide from my fingertips, or would have, had I not been a ghost. For all my ghostly form, I definitely felt the sting of scraped skin. I propped my hands on my hips and peered thoughtfully at the cave. The light in Alex's hand wavered. He was shaking with the cold, unable to keep his hand steady. "I'm sorry, I didn't have a jacket to lend you."
I don't think I could wear your clothes, you being a ghost, you know.
His brave attempt at humour fell flat. His face glowed eerily in the soft glow of his thin black box, and I shuddered at the sight. I pulled at the rock again.
It must be nice,
Alex commented, his voice scarcely above a sigh. I jerked to attention. I eyed him narrowly. "What?" His hesitation and drooping eyelids alarmed me. Perk up, lad. I don't have time to waste whilst you make idle chit-chat. What must be nice? He gave himself a small shake.
To be a ghost, I guess, and the cold not bother you.
I was satisfied with his answer, but not the way he spoke it. Glancing about, I spied the dark length of a fallen limb. Grasping it with both hands, I hefted it, approving the sturdiness and girth of the branch. Stepping back to the cave, I wedged one end of the branch against the fallen stone slab, near Alex's leg. When I tell you, pull your leg out. He gave a slow nod. Bracing one foot ahead of the other, I tested the limb's metal. It had a bit of gift to it, but didn't seem in danger of snapping in twain. I gripped the sturdy branch with both hands. Ready? Alex nodded.
Yeah.
I took a deep breath and pulled down on the limb, putting my weight against it to add force. But I was a ghost, and though I managed to make the rock budge, my weight was of little consequence. Alex howled and grabbed his leg.
Oh, stop.
I immediately released the limb. What happened?
My leg. I don't know if the rock is pressing on it more now or what, but it hurts.
He'd set his slim black box on the ground next to him, and its upward beam highlighted the worry on his face, the sheen of tears in his eyes. Another blast of cold air scattered my hair and turned his skin an ashen hue. I must get help. His eyes rounded with anxiety and fear.
Don't leave me.
I dinna like it, Alex, but I canna do this on my own.
What'll I do while you're gone?
Och, you will not be going anywhere, will you? I set the branch aside and stepped to the lad. 'Tis too cold for you to worry about fearsome things visiting you while I'm gone. We haven't anything wilder than rabbits here, and they're not daft enough to be out in this weather. He managed a half grin.
Or kelpies, either.
His voice squeaked. If you'd worried about that earlier, we wouldn't be here, aye? I reminded him in a brisk, sisterly voice. He laughed. I breathed a sigh of relief. I'd changed his humour, but I had no way to change his exposure to the weather. Sit tight and dinna wander off. I'll be back before you can figure out what a tattyboggle is. Alex perked up.
What's a tattyboggle?
I expect you to have it figured out before the time I return.
You're planning on being gone a really long time, aren't you?
This time I laughed and ruffled his hair. Nay, I'll nip back to the house and be back in no time. I'm a ghost, you know. He nodded, relief washing across his face. And Alex?
Yeah.
I read the papers the English solicitor has. They aren't divorce papers. Your ma and da are purchasing a house here in Scotland.
What?
His voice sounded stronger, hope clinging to that single word. I dinna know for certain, but I'd think your ma has been unhappy about the move, and your da has been busy trying to get his business to run itself whilst he was here. 'Tis true the move is troublesome between them, but all the more reason for you to listen and understand. Will you do that for me when you return to Rasaay House? Alex was silent for a few minutes.
Yeah, do you think my friend Tony was wrong? I know Ma had some sort of great-great-uncle die a few weeks ago, and it made her really sad. Maybe she inherited the house or something.
Aye, and though a bit of a change from your home in the States, it wouldn't be so bad to live here, would it?
Can I still have you and Alistair for friends?
Och, I doubt that. I was only sent here to help. I dinna believe I shall be here much longer. His expression clouded, but the news his parents weren't divorcing had given him encouragement. I gestured to his black case. Turn off that box of yours and save the battery. I'd seen that happen to many people at the Culloden Visitor Centre. Such a calamity was usually accompanied by muttered words I shouldn't repeat, as they scrambled for fresh batteries or a place to plug in whatever piece of modern technology they'd forgotten to charge. Alex obliged, and we were plunged into darkness. Your eyes will adjust, dinna fash. I'll give a shout when I'm near.
Hurry, will you?
His excitement waned in the cold. I'm off. With a backward glance to fix him in my mind, I set off as quick as I could. Not as fast as I'd led young Alex to believe, for I'd no mystical powers, but as brisk as my 2 feet on familiar ground could carry me. Chapter 11. Though I couldn't say I made the trip back to the house in record time, the glow of lighted rooms appeared quicker than I'd hoped. My feet skidded over the frosted ground, and the mist thickened as the air grew colder. The skirt of my dress clung damply to my legs, its hem stiffening with rime. I slipped effortlessly through Rasaay House's closed door into blessed warmth and skimmed through the halls in search of Alistair. I popped in and out of the common rooms, but didn't see him. I called to him, loudly, uncaring if this time someone was bothered by the noise, hoping someone could hear me. A shadow moved, where there shouldn't be a shadow, over the threshold and fading down the stair. Alistair, wait! I scrambled after the ghost as he floated through a window and into the yard. He drifted faster, caught on the edge of the storm, and vanished behind a heavy door. I followed and found myself in a cellar. Items stacked neatly on the shelves and pushed into slots along the wall held little interest for me as I scanned the room for Alistair. Alistair! I pivoted on my heels, searching. At last, his ghostly presence solidified into the young man I knew. He lifted his head, sorrowful gaze meeting mine.
I can't find him.
I did. He's at Uav Nan Rev. His leg pinned between 2 rocks. We must get there quickly, Alistair.
Nay, 'tis not my feet. He can't be found. You're mistaken.
I stomped my foot. Not Callum, ya Amadon. Young Alex. Alistair shook his head slowly back and forth, his gaze pinned somewhere behind me, seeing something which had disappeared long ago.
I saw them, Duncan and Callum. I rescued my lad, but I can't find wee Callum. I've searched all the rooms, and the house burns about me.
My heart plummeted. I'd seen it before at Culloden among the ghosts, even myself, though only a handful of times in the past almost 300 years. Something, a sound, an odour, a thought, would transport us back to the moments just before our death, as if living it over and over would somehow change the outcome. Mayhap if I'd run faster and not hesitated that day on the moor. Mayhap if Alistair had taken a different path through the house on his search for my wee brother. None of that mattered now. 'Twas in the past, and naught could change what had been done. Alex was of importance now, and I couldn't save him without Alistair's help. I approached him carefully, knowing he didn't see me as he had an hour earlier. Alistair, you're a braw man, but the lad you seek isn't here. I caught my breath on a shattered sob. He died long ago. Tears blurred my vision as something inside me broke loose and the rage and despair fell away. I knew my family had been driven from Rasaay, except for wee Callum, who had died before his 4th birthday at the hands of cruel, vengeful men. 'Twas not the fate I'd wished for my wee brother, but 'twas the truth, and Alistair had died trying to save him. He was the embodiment of honour and caring, and it broke my heart to see him so lost. 'Twas your fate to die that day, but 'tis not for you to relive the event time and again. I stretched my hand toward him. Come with me, Alistair. Help me save Alex and redeem your life. He blinked, a bit of sanity returning, clearing his gaze.
The lad is English, and I swore my vengeance nearly 3 centuries ago. His fate will not change mine.
I bit my lip in frustration. I briefly considered returning to the house for paper and pen to write a note explaining where Alex was and leaving it for his parents to find. But I couldn't abandon Alistair to his deep despair. Somehow, His fate was tied to Alex's. Then follow me and simply stand beside me. I'm so much stronger when you're with me. To my surprise, he nodded and took my hand. We left the cellar and stepped into the brunt of a gale. Alistair grunted, tipping his head into the wind.
"'Tis blowing a hoolie."
We retraced our steps from the cellar back to the house, the brief respite from the cold welcome, as we wound through the corridors and out the front of the house again. "Wait!" I darted back inside and snatched up a wool blanket which had been draped over the back of a chair in the front hall. I bundled it as small as I could to protect it from the weather and tucked it close against me. Alistair knew the area as well as I, and we mustered our way through the stinging sleet and spitters, tiny drops of rain-driven snow that threatened the lad's life. I called for Alex, but the storm ripped the words from my mouth, sending them somewhere behind my shoulder amidst a snarl of wind and groaning trees. We managed several more steps, then I called again. "Alex!" A light winked faint ahead. I tugged Alistair's hand. "Come!" He followed me at a pace behind, releasing my hand as I surged forward. Moments later I spied Alex, a brave smile on his face, as his teeth chattered with the cold. I draped the wool blanket over his head and around his shoulders, blocking the wind from his small body.
That's better."
He shuddered.
"And you brought Superman with you?"
I glanced over my shoulder where Alistair stood, hands deep in his pockets, not to keep them warm, but from the uneasy look in his eyes to maintain his distance. "I'll need you to help me ease the rock from young Alex's leg." Conflict raged across his face. He'd witnessed the deaths of innocents at the hands of men sent here by 2 brutal English officers, and to help the son of an Englishman was currently beyond his ability. 'Twas no wonder he haunted the house, no wonder he had no peace. His honour and compassion was for the wee lad he had been unable to save nearly 300 years ago, and until he forgave himself, naught else mattered. I patted Alex's head. "Give me a moment with yon lad, then we'll get you right out of this mess, dinny fash."
"Dinny fash?"
he repeated, his tongue slurring the words.
"You said it before. What does it mean?"
"It means dinny worry yourself. We'll have you back at Rasaay House and in a warm bath in no time." He gave a sleepy nod, his eyelids drifting closed. I wanted to shake him, shout at him to stay awake, but I needed a few moments' peace whilst I spoke with Alistair, and I left Alex alone. Meeting Alistair's gaze directly, I begged him silently to stay with me, not fade away into that dreamlike state where it was June 1746, when smoke filled his lungs and despair shredded his heart. "Alistair, I need your help, aye?" His hair whipped about in the skirl, and shadows swept across the planes of his face, giving him the look of a hardened warrior, hardened and outraged. His low chant rose and fell on the wind.
"They burned our houses, raped the women, slaughtered our cattle and left us to die. You ask me to help them."
"I'm asking you to help a wee lad who is trapped."
"An English lad."
"Alistair, I know how hard you tried."
"I feel, Sorsha. You didn't know how bad it is at times. I swore to your wee brawler I would exact revenge wherever I found it."
You swore dark things to a bairn who was light and laughter and a wee bit of mischief. He wouldn't hold you to your words uttered in despair. Alistair began to pace, his hands flinching with each step.
"How alone and frightened he must have been, Sorsha. I'd give my life 100 times over to save him just once."
I stepped to his side, laying my palm to his arm to halt him. "I know, Alistair, and Callum can't blame you. When will you stop blaming yourself?" His eyes shone bright in the scattered moonlight.
"'Tis my fate to be lost forever, because I failed."
Gripping his arms tight, I gave him a light shake. Nay, Alistair, 'tis not that you failed, 'tis that you tried. He stilled, and his body relaxed beneath my hands. He raised desolate eyes to mine.
How do I let go, Sorcia?
I'll help you, but you must promise to help me. We both lost everything, and we both have reason to hate. But my heart lightens a wee bit with a chance to help someone else.
You're a wise woman, Sorcia MacLeod.
The corners of his lips caught the barest hint of a smile as the firm quality of his voice returned. I beamed at him, thrilled to have the Alistair I had recently grown to know back with me. He pointed to Alex, who slumped against a small tree.
Let's help your wee Englishman.
He's only half English, I replied as I darted to Alex's side. Alex cracked an eyelid. He mustered a grin.
I knew you'd find him. And a tattleboggle is what we call a scarecrow in the US.
I fisted my hands on my hips and gave him a narrow look. Bundling him in the bit of wool must have done him a world of good, for his teeth no longer chattered, and he appeared almost cheerful. And how did you come by that knowledge, lad? You're too clever by half. His gaze darted to one side.
She told me.
I gasped at the faint green glow silhouetting a tree to Alex's right. The light intensified, and Soni stepped forward. He's a braw lad, and none the worse for his jaunt into the night, though he needs a bit of warm broth inside him and mayhap a stool to prop his leg upon. Alistair placed himself between Soni and me.
Who are ye?
I reeled from the emotions flooding me at Soni's unexpected appearance. Dinny fash, Alistair, I know her. Alex shifted his blanket about him.
She tells me that a lot. She must know people who do a lot of worrying. But Sansaray helped me while you and Sorcia had a talk. She got my leg unstuck quick as anything.
He canted his head at the wee witch.
Though she doesn't look very strong.
I frowned. Och, looks can be deceiving. Is my time up then? I glanced at Alex, sitting on top of the damaged cave, as if he'd not a care in the world. His leg no longer trapped between the rocks. Did I earn my boon or not? She gave Alex an assessing look. I believe young Alex will be fine, but he's not the one I sent you to help. My stomach lurched. I had been right. There was another I should have helped. But I couldn't have left Alex to his fate in the cold, dark night. What did I do wrong? I racked my mind for signs I'd missed. Who? There was another soul here as tormented as you by the past. I had hoped to save you both an eternity of self-doubt and torment. She smiled happily. Alistair MacLeod will not experience any more of the nightmares that have plagued him for the last 200 years and more. Your kindness overlooked the possibility of abandoning Alex to his fate simply because of his English heritage, and prompted Alistair to follow you on a path to forgiveness. She spread her arms wide, her cape billowing about her like great dark wings. Well done, lass. I didn't doubt you for a moment. Chapter 12. Alistair's chin thrust forward belligerently.
What are you talking about, you wee witch? We dinna need the likes of ye around here.
I inhaled on a gasp. To my surprise, Soni didn't take offence, but instead laughed at him. No, you didn't need me. I know you could have helped Circa free young Alex's leg, but once you made the decision to put aside your need for revenge and see your anger for what it really is, your inability to forgive yourself for not saving wee Callum, I saw no reason to let Alex linger whilst you set about his rescue. Alistair growled.
He was in no danger.
Soni shrugged. Of course he was. I can't step in and change someone's fate. I'd run myself absolutely ragged if I had that kind of power. You must all make decisions for yourself. Though, once the deed was as good as done. Is my time up then? The cave wasn't so far from the house. Alex didn't need my help getting back, and I guessed Alistair could walk with him. But I didn't wish to leave Alistair just yet. Alistair flinched as he turned a despairing look my way.
You must leave.
'Twas the bargain, darling. Much as I'd like, I can't stay. I scrunched one side of my face in a ghastly attempt at a smile. Rasaay House doesn't need 2 ghosts. He fumbled for my hand.
I didn't wish you to leave. You've no idea how much you've changed me. I'd lost a wife, a bairn, and had no idea where my wee lad had gone after the fire. I've been afraid to do more than ramble about this place, looking for the one thing I thought could change my fate.
He lifted one hand, laying gentle fingers across my cheek in a soft caress.
And then I found ye. I couldn't turn back time and save your wee brother, though I'd tried to sell my soul for that very thing, and I couldn't punish all Englishmen for what a few had done. In the midst of my torment, ye woke my heart again. To my surprise, it again had the capacity to care, to love.
His eyes pleaded as his grip on my hands tightened.
Please, don't leave me. There's in me a spot only ye can fill.
My heart overflowed with the wealth of love in Alistair's eyes. I turned to Soni. Can you nae free him from Rasaay House? There's nae reason he shouldn't be content and remember no more what kept him here. I'll trade my boon for his chance to rest at peace. What say ye? Soni shook her head. 'Tis a noble offer, Sir Hugh MacLeod, but your ties here are broken. You now know the fate of your family and have acquitted yourself well helping young Alex reconcile with his family and breaking Alistair's curse. Now 'tis time to accept your boon. I faced Alistair, lacing my fingers with his. I haven't felt so whole as I have since I met you. It gladdens me to know you are now free. I smiled through the building tears and gently pulled free of his grip. Farewell, Alistair. It seems I must be about my next step. I believe Prince Charlie has some answering to do. Alistair stepped to Alex's side and placed an arm about the lad's shoulders.
I'll see him back to the house. Give the prince a question from me, aye.
Alex's eyes widened as he viewed the tableau around him, but he kept his words and thoughts to himself. Mayhap 'twas my imagination, but it seemed he stood a wee bit taller with Alistair by his side. My last sight was of the 2 of them, their dark blonde heads and stance giving them an uncanny look of closeness. Before I could remark on it, the air changed, and I knew I was no longer on the beach near Rasaay House. A fire burned on the hearth, casting golden light about the room, pushing ineffectively at the encroaching shadows. From the dress of the woman sitting close to the bed, 'twas winter outside, and despite the fire, nose-biting cold lurked in the corners of the room. Someone lay on the bed, and I crept closer for a better look. The woman glanced up, startled, and I halted, surprised she could see me. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a curious inflection, though her words were in French. "My name is Sir Hugh MacLeod. I am here to see the prince." A sorrowful look crossed her face. "He is here before you. It is likely his last day on earth." I took a cautious step forward, my gaze focused on the man beneath the pile of blankets. The skin of his face showed an unhealthy hue, even in the poor lighting, with dark tracings of veins scattered like heavy lacework across his sagging cheeks and bulbous nose. A velvet cap topped his head, no doubt to help keep him warm, and the bedclothes and rich appointments in the room bespoke a privileged life. "Did you know my father?" the woman asked. "I do not recall seeing you here before." I glanced from her simple brocade gown to my own skirt. astonished to find myself in a serviceable gown that bespoke the period, not my modern dress from Rasaay House. I was, however, still 16. My, family knew of him in Scotland. I'd wished to speak with him, but I fear I'm too late. My condolences. Don't leave yet, she begged. His brother, the Cardinal, will be here shortly. But it is a lonely vigil. Would he know you? I shook my head. Nay. Tales of the Prince have oft been told in my family. As I am Scottish, I cannae say the stories are completely endearing. The woman jerked to her feet. I beg your pardon, mademoiselle, but my manners have fled. Please be seated. I am Charlotte, Duchess of Albany. I dropped a deep curtsy, my eyes to the floor. Your Grace. She waved away my words, pulling me to my feet. Please sit. My mother was Scottish, and I missed the sound of her speech. For a time we chatted briefly about Scotland. On the bed, Prince Charles Stuart laboured for breath. The Duchess canted her head to the side as she gazed at her sire. His life is at an end. I wish I could say these last years have been good to him, but they have been quite the opposite. My mother left him years ago, and his marriage to Princess Louise did not last long. 'Twas only in his loneliness that he remembered my existence at all, and asked me to live with him. I have done what I could do to ease his last few years, but excess of drink and his temper do not pair well together, and he has lost more than he could stand, including his life. I stared at the prince. Gone was the flush of charismatic youth. Gone was the young man who'd captured the heart and imagination of a nation. Despite his comfortable means, his life had been one of disappointment and despair. I rose. I'll give you now, Your Grace. I believe I've seen what I was meant to. My family was much embittered by his failure to claim Scotland's throne, but I now see there was little grandeur for him at the end. No, his life has been very troubled. You were kind to see this. I shook my head. Not kindness, mayhap a bit of sympathy 'tis all. He never gave up his dream to return to Scotland, she said. To that I had no reply. Chapter 13. I walked through the door of the palazzo into a bitter winter night. Not so different from when I'd left Rasaay at Soni's whim, mayhap only an hour or so earlier. Tiny snowflakes lit on my hair, and I tasted the white ice on my tongue. Of the two other people on the street, bundled heavily against the night air, neither paid me the slightest attention. What was I to do now? What would happen next? I'd had a few minutes in a room with the dying prince and discovered he was a 67-year-old fat invalid, addicted to too much alcohol. Scarcely the stuff legends are made of. Yet even in the modern age I'd just left, a Jacobite could be spotted as he toasted Prince Charlie by passing his drink surreptitiously over a glass of water, a tribute to the prince exiled across the sea. I leaned against one of the columns at the front entrance, the guards having stepped inside against the cold. No doubt they would rebuff anyone who dared enter the palazzo without permission, but they would scarcely worry over one weary ghost. 'Twasn't what you expected. I lifted my head at Soni's words, not too surprised to find her nearby. My boon was to speak a few words with the prince, not watch him die. You still could have said what you wished. For all the good it would do me. I waved a hand in the air. Never mind. I'm too weary of it all to argue with you now. He died a wretched man, unworthy of the fierce loyalty the Scots showed him. I jerked away from the pillar, hands clenched into tight fists. He may have been wretched and unworthy, but at least he had money and a place to sleep. He even kept his lofty status, calling himself Charles III after his dad died, and benefiting from his brother's largesse, whilst the Highlanders were left to deal with the poverty and utter misery set on them by the Hanoverian government. You're correct. But the man who led the Jacobites to disaster was scarcely more notable than the man you saw tonight. He charmed many, Sorka, not the least of whom was that woman's poor mother. She still believed in him. Nay, she still loved him, and I believe felt dismay for what he'd become. I glanced at my hands, releasing the tension in my fists as my fingers spread wide. Looking about me, I breathed the cold air, feeling the heavy ache as it settled in my chest. I pity him, I murmured. He was beset from all sides by those who wished to push, shove, and follow him to court. He died wretchedly alone and never attained what he considered was his birthright. And you, Sorka, what about you? I may have died 43 years before him, but at least I lived 16 wonderful years. A tall, slender man in a long black cape strolled down the street, the toe of his cane tapped against the cobblestones.
I believe she understands.
I pivoted toward the new voice. Soni gave the man a hug, then turned back to me, a beaming smile on her face. It truly wouldn't be altering things a great deal, Uncle, she said, with a winsome tilt to her head. And she's learned so much. The man, her uncle, frowned.
You've found a new way to bend the rules, have you, lass?
He sent me a searching look.
Is there anything you regret, Hugh MacLeod?
My mind went blank beneath his piercing gaze, and I wondered if I'd been caught snitching pasties from my ma's cooling shelf. I shook myself to dispel the memory and swallowed as I gathered my errant thoughts. Nay, I still would have followed my brothers off to war. They were my closest friends, nae matter the trouble they caused. Soni tilted her head sympathetically. Puddies in your bed? I bit my lip. I put the frogs in their bed. The man snorted and turned his head to cough into his gloved fist. I regret not being able to spend more time with Alistair. I attempted to turn their attention from my misdeeds as a youth, but I truly meant it. Alistair had been unexpected, a link to my past I could share with no other, and a truly honourable man who said he'd miss me. Soni gave her uncle's cape a tug. She could let Alistair know the truth? I snorted. What? That Prince Charlie? Wasn't he bonny when he died? Both she and her uncle glanced at me. Nay, that young Alex is descendant from wee Duncan on his mother's side. Elation raced through me. 'Twas no wonder they had a similar look. And if his ma had heard half the stories I had about life on Rasaay after Culloden, and the why and how of her great something grand fella fleeing the island, 'twas clear she would have reservations about moving there, dreading to dread up a past of which she wasn't a part. I shook my head. She'd soon learn the island's people were as warm and welcoming now as they'd been when I lived there. Could I tell him? I asked. I'd like that above all else. Soni cut a smile between her uncle and me. I think we could do better than that. Epilogue. Alistair gave a snort at the shiny pole and line young Alex waved in the air as he sprinted across the beach.
You canna fish with that contraption. Do you not know there is a law that states all lines must be the same length, or risk putting one fisherman at an advantage o'er the other?
Young Alex skidded to a halt.
Truth.
He looked up from Alistair to me, a puzzled look on his face. I laughed. Leave off teasing the lad, Alistair. 'Tis an outdated law, and the lad can use that, whatever it is, if he wishes. Alistair grabbed my hand and pulled me beneath one arm in a gentle hug.
Then we'll watch and see how it works.
He winked to Alex.
And hope the lad doesn't get pulled into the sea by a whale.
Alex grinned.
No kelpies. Nay, though I've heard tell of silkies in the area.
Alex's face lit with the hope of a story.
Tell me.
Alistair waved him off.
Hie yourself to the water and cast your line. I've something I wish to discuss with Sorcia.
Alex grinned and charged down the beach to a large rock in the distance, where he settled for an afternoon of fishing. With luck, he and his parents would dine on fresh fish this eve. I turned to Alistair. What did you want to discuss? Holding my hand firmly, he gave a jerk of his chin to the lad soaking up the sun, and a good bit of water as he cast his line into the ocean.
Have I given you thanks for telling me of Alex's story?
His eyes searched mine, a sunny smile tilting his lips. I gave the matter some thought, pondering his question for several moments. With a shout of rueful laughter, Alistair grasped my waist and lifted me into the air. Suspended above him, I stared into his beloved face. Aye, though not today, I teased him. You should thank me properly. He lowered me slowly until our lips touched, then eased me further until my feet reached the ground. I wrapped my arms about his neck and accepted his more than adequate thanks. 'Twas good to be home. On a tiny island between Skye and the mainland, an island no more than 15 miles long and 4 miles wide, lies the reconstructed manor house that once belonged to the chief of the MacLeods. Many changes have come over Rasaay House in the centuries since the Battle of Culloden Moor changed the fate of Scotland, and a loyal group of Jacobites determined to put a Stuart king back on the throne. One of the changes is ever enduring, and if you look about at just the right time and listen closely over the cries of eagles and the voicings of whales, dolphins and seals, you might catch sight of a pair of young ghosts, hand in hand, as they explore their island home, or hear them call a warning to a strayed visitor on their fair isle, even if he's an Englishman.
This has been MacLeod, The Ghosts of Culloden Moor, Book 21, written by Cathy McRae, narrated by Andrew McDermott and Jen McGurk. Copyright 2022 by Catherine Dodson. Production copyright by Catherine Dodson.